Aloha Trinity Ohana. Welcome to another one of our video devotions. Today we're looking at Psalm 84. This psalm is especially fitting during this unique season that we find ourselves in, away from corporate worship with God's people, because this psalm, Psalm 84, actually moves us to desire and long for the worship of God with God's people. At the very beginning of Psalm 84, the psalmist can hardly contain his joy when he thinks about worshiping God in Zion. He writes, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts! My soul longs, yes, faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and flesh sing for joy to the living God." The psalmist is overcome with joy over the thought of worshiping God and worshiping with God's people. Then the psalmist sort of widens his view from himself to all of God's people when he says in verse 4, "Blessed are those who dwell in your house, ever singing your praise." You see, he switches from the first person now to speak of all of God's people who are blessed. And here's an indication that the psalmist is indeed speaking about temple worship, but he also has in view a deep longing for communion and fellowship with God, dwelling in God's house forever. And then he continues to speak outside of the first person to the rest of God's blessed people. And in verses 5 to 7, he describes the journey to Zion, the journey to Zion. And you'll notice he's not speaking about the physical journey, although he's using that imagery. But he's actually speaking about what's going on in the hearts of God's people. Listen to what he says in verse 5. He said, "Blessed are those whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the roadways to Zion." There were many roads that physically led to Zion, to Jerusalem. And men and women and children would make this journey, oftentimes days, to make sort of that pilgrimage to Jerusalem to worship God in the temple courts. But here he says, "Blessed are those whose heart are the highways to Zion." It is a very beautiful way of describing God's blessed people whose hearts desire and seek to worship Him. The psalmist continues on the same theme with this pilgrimage to Zion imagery, this traveling imagery. And he says in verse 6, "As they go through the valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs. The early rain also covers it with pools. They go from strength to strength. Each one appears before God in Zion." This verse 6, mentions the valley of Baca. This is a desolate valley in the kingdom of Judah. And the word Baca in Hebrew actually means weeping. And so it seems to be describing a person who is strengthened by the Lord, who travels through the valley of weeping. It becomes a place of springs. They go from strength to strength, and each one appears before God in Zion. Here, the psalmist is speaking of God not only bringing us to joy in Him, but also God strengthening us and sustaining us through the valley of weeping. And the way that He does this is by fixing our eyes upon Zion and by satisfying us with the joy of His presence. The last part of this psalm that I want to point out is verse 10. The psalmist writes, "For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness." He is speaking here about the absolute privilege and blessing that it is to worship God, to commune with God. It is an amazing thing when he says a day worshiping in your temple courts is better than 1,000 days doing, who knows, doing anything else other than worshiping God. One day far surpasses 1,000 others. And he says that he would rather be a doorkeeper, a gatekeeper is really the word, who stands even outside of the outer gates, the outer walls to the temple, not even inside the temple, but out in the outer walls. He'd rather be a gatekeeper than to dwell in the comfortable and lavish tents of the wicked. We know that the psalmist is looking toward the physical temple in Jerusalem and temple worship, but he's also looking beyond the physical temple, and he's longing for the hope of worshiping God forever. And as we meditate on this psalm, we can't help but think about the great privilege and blessing that we have to worship God. The temple, you may know, is no longer standing in Jerusalem. It was destroyed in 70 AD, was never rebuilt again. And so we don't long for that physical temple, but rather as new covenant believers, God has made his presence known to us in Jesus Christ, and we have been given the Holy Spirit to dwell in us. And so we as individuals and as the church are called in the New Testament the temple of God. And there is no greater joy than to worship with God's people. I want to close by reading Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 to 24, speaking of the blessing and privilege that we have in worship. The author to the Hebrews writes, "But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel." We have come to the heavenly Jerusalem, and God has blessed us by giving us and allowing us to experience this worship by his Spirit. And indeed, when we worship together, it is a foretaste of the worship that we will enjoy forever. May we long for this worship. May we long for that day when we worship God forever, on that day that has no end. And may we also look forward during this time in our present circumstances to when we get to worship together as a body in person, as a foretaste of that heavenly worship. Thanks so much for joining us. God bless, and see you next time.